So last week, we named the hard truth that we are far more committed to this path of ascent than we are descent. We are trained to climb, to improve and fix and justify ourselves. We can carry that instinct straight into our faith. We assume that if we work hard enough, if we believe correctly enough and avoid enough mistakes, then God will meet us with approval. Romans 5 interrupts that story. Paul tells us that the gospel does not begin with effort. It begins with a gift, not with ascent that you did, but descent that Christ did. Not with what we do for God, but what God has already done for every one of us. And if last week showed us where the path of descent begins, it begins with honesty, suffering, humility, confession, then this week shows us why it works. It works because grace abounds. Paul begins our passage by taking us all the way back to Adam, like Adam and Eve. And that might feel strange at first, but I really think Paul is less interested in ancient history and is more interested in trying to name a pattern throughout the human condition. Adam represents the human instinct to grasp, to control, to take for ourselves what we think is going to make us whole. Adam's story is not just about disobedience. It's really about mistrust, the belief that God's holding out on us, and the belief that if we can ascend, we can become more like God. We can know what God knows. And that's really the path to life. And Paul says when Adam chose the knowledge of good and evil, when Adam chose the path of ascent, to be like God, that's when sin entered the world. Not just as an individual bad behavior, but now sin has power over the world. Sin is now a reckoning force, a current that pulls humanity towards things like self-reliance, self-protection, self-justification. In other words, Adam initiates and names for us this path of ascent. And we know this path all too well. We live in it every time we believe that we have to earn our worth. Every time we hide weakness instead of telling the truth. Every time we assume control is safer than trust. Now, Paul says that through Adam, sin multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. But then he introduces a phrase in verse 15 that should stop all of us in our tracks. But the free gift is not like the trespass. That phrase is worth highlighting. Paul is illustrating that grace doesn't simply counteract sin. Grace overwhelms it. Paul continues in that verse. But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died through the one man's trespass, much more surely have the grace of God and the gift in the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for the many. In other words, grace, it's not fragile. Grace is not even evenly matched to sin. Grace does not barely squeak by. Grace abounds. Grace is so much more with Christ than sin is with Adam. These are not one-to-one ratios here. And this is where the path of descent becomes not just honest, It becomes hopeful. God's grace doesn't meet us after we climb our way out of sin. Grace meets us inside of whatever hole we dug ourselves into. Grace doesn't wait for us to reverse the damage. Grace enters the damage and then begins something new. So several years ago, I think you can identify with this. There was a friend of mine who told me about what it was like for them to learn to swim as a child. One afternoon, they slipped into the water that was much deeper than they had expected. And the child immediately began to panic. They thrashed and kicked and tried to pull themselves up above the water, convinced that if they could just get their head above the surface, then everything would be fine. But the harder the kid fought, the more exhausted he became. What saved him wasn't his effort. It wasn't his strength. It was the lifeguard who dove into the water after him. The lifeguard didn't stand on the edge of the pool just shouting instructions. Just get your head above water. The lifeguard didn't wait for the little boy to calm down and to swim better. The lifeguard entered the chaos, wrapped his arms around the boy, and carried him to safety. That's what Paul means about grace. God doesn't wait for us to climb out of the water. God dives in. Grace doesn't shout advice from the sidelines. Grace enters the panic, the mess, the damage, and then begins something new on the inside. And this is why the path of descent is not just honest, it's hopeful. Because when we finally stop thrashing and admit that we are in over our heads with sin, then we discover that grace has already been holding us. Paul is saying that Jesus doesn't just undo Adam's mistake. Jesus creates an entirely new reality. If Adam introduces sin in the biblical story, then it's Christ who introduces grace. If Adam is the one that introduces us to the concept of death, then it's Jesus that overcomes it with life. If Adam is the part of the story that multiplies brokenness throughout humanity, then it's Jesus who stops multiplying it with the use of mercy. And notice how this happens. Jesus doesn't arrive as a triumphant conqueror when he hits the earth. He doesn't overpower sin from a distance. He doesn't rise above the human weakness. Jesus descends into the waters, into flesh, into suffering, into rejection, unto death. And then grace abounds because Christ descended all the way down. This path matters to us because if this is right, if grace abounds in the descent, then faith is not a repetition of earnings. It's more about exposure. It's a faith that knows that it can stop pretending it's better than it really is. It's a faith that's willing to tell the truth about our lives and to trust that grace is going to meet us right where we are. And Paul makes this unmistakably clear when he says this in verse 18. Therefore, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. That righteousness, it's not moral perfection that you've accomplished. It's faithful love that flows from God. It's obedience rooted in trust. It's self-giving all the way down. which means grace is not unlocked by your ability to climb and improve. Grace is received when we surrender. The path of ascent will tell us, you can fix yourself and then you can approach the throne of God. But it's the path of descent that blesses us and says, you can come to God just as you are. Let grace do what you cannot. And this is where we often get a bit uncomfortable, because descent means letting go of that story that we have in our heads that we're in control. It means releasing the belief that our worth depends on our ability to perform. It means trusting that God's love is not fragile, that it will not disappear when we stop trying so hard to deserve it. So what do we need to stop trying so hard? What we just did with Jane. You have got to confess. Confess to God the thing you were trying to control. Confess to God your attempts to ascend, to overcome or fly over or to avoid altogether the pain of your life. Confess. That is the path of grace. Paul is clear. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Grace that is not exhausted by repetition. Grace that's not surprised by our failure. Grace that is not withdrawn when we fall short again and again and again. It's grace that abounds. And this abundance, it's not theoretical. It's very personal. It means that when we descend into honesty, grace will meet you there. When we descend into confession, grace will meet you there. When we descend into grief and doubt, addiction, failure, fear, grace meets us there, no matter the cost. Not because those things are good, but because Christ has already gone there before you. This path of descent, it doesn't invite us to just wallow in sin. It invites us to stop denying it. And when we stop denying how often we sin, we discover that grace is already present, already active, already more powerful than we imagined, walking along with us. So as we continue down this path of ascent, this Lenten season, I hope you don't feel anxious. I hope that you don't have to be afraid of what you're going to find when that light shines in your darkness. Because what we find at the bottom is not condemnation from God. Maybe from the world, maybe from people around you, and maybe even your understanding of who you should be. But that condemnation does not come from God. What comes from God is abundance. It's grace upon grace, gift upon gift, life upon life. That's the good news of the gospel. When we stop climbing, grace takes over. When we descend, grace abounds.